and I will start the webinar in 3, 2, 1.
Hi, everybody. I'm Deb Hackenberry, and this is Cher's webinar on intermittent fasting. We'll be with you in just a few moments. Thank you. Well, hello, everyone. I want to welcome you to our webinar on intermittent fasting, how it can reduce the risk of breast cancer recurrence. I'm Deb Hackenberry, Program Project Manager at Cher. And before the presentation begins, I'd like to tell you a little bit about Cher. Cher is a nonprofit organization. It's been helping people through breast, ovarian, and uterine cancer for the last 45 years. We offer support to those. We have educational programs, we have webinars, and we have a helpline. And all of these services, in terms of many of these services, I should say, are provided by people who have been there. All services are free of charge to participants. And if you'd like more information, please visit our website at sharecancersupport.org. All participants will be muted during the presentation. When Dr. Webster finishes presenting, we will begin the Q&A discussion. You're welcome to submit questions during the presentation through the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. The chat section will be disabled. When asking questions, please remember that the presenter is unable to give specific medical advice, so keep your questions general in nature. The webinar is being recorded and will be available on the Cher website soon. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Nicholas Webster, PhD, MA, is the Chief of Endocrinology and Metabolism in the Department of Medicine at the University of California, San Diego. Academically, he trained at Cambridge University, where he held a Wilson Scholarship in Natural Sciences. He also received his PhD from Stanford University. He was then awarded a Royal Society Fellowship for postdoctoral studies at CNRS in Strasbourg, France. Dr. Webster is also currently the Senior Research Career Scientist in the Research Service in VA San Diego Healthcare System. Now I would like to get started with the webinar. Thank you, and welcome, Dr. Webster.
Hey, well, thank you very much, and I'd like to thank Cher for the opportunity to talk about some of our data. So let me share my screen. Okay, does everyone see the screen okay?
Yes.
So what I would like to talk about today is some of the studies that we've been doing looking at time-restricted feeding and its effects on breast cancer. So this is the outline for the talk, and there's really 3 areas that I want to go through. Firstly, I'm going to talk about what do we know about obesity and breast cancer, from population studies, and then if we take steps to reduce obesity, can that reduce cancer risk? And then the middle portion of the talk will be looking at preclinical studies that we've been doing, looking at using timed feeding to synchronize circadian rhythms and looking at its effects on obesity-driven breast cancer. And then towards the end of the talk, I want to switch back to humans and then discuss whether this sort of timed eating approach might be applicable to humans. And we'll discuss if there's any evidence that this could have a beneficial effect on cancer outcomes. So the take-home message today, if you don't get anything else out of my talk, this is what I want you to go home with, that when you eat matters as much as what you eat. For years and years, we've been focused on diet, low carbohydrate, low fat, paleo diets, ketogenic diets, Mediterranean diets, South Park diets, all kinds of diets. But I want to tell you that doesn't matter. What matters is when you eat the calories. So that's the take-home message. All right, so what's the link between obesity and cancer? So this is taken from the American Association for Cancer Research from their annual report. And it lists all of the cancers that have been associated with obesity. So there's 15 cancers that are known to be affected by obesity. So the ones that are just affected by obesity are shown in red. There are also 9 cancers that are known to be reduced, or the risk is reduced, with physical activity. And those are shown in light blue. And then the ones in dark blue are the cancers that are known to be affected by both obesity and physical activity. So my lab is particularly interested in hold on, let me pull up a laser pointer. My lab is particularly interested in liver cancer and in breast cancer. And these are 2 cancers that are both linked to obesity and also physical activity. So what's some of the evidence that there is a link here with breast cancer and obesity? So taking a very high level view, we can look at the prevalence of obesity worldwide. And this is taken from the World Health Organization. And it basically shows the prevalence of obesity in different countries. And you can see in the dark olive green here, countries where obesity rates are over 30%. Now, obesity is defined as having a body mass index of greater than 30 kilograms per meter squared. If we include people who are overweight, but not obese, the numbers actually look a little different. So now countries such as the US and countries in Northern Africa and the Middle East, they have obesity rates and overweight rates of greater than 60%. So someone who's overweight is considered someone who's got a BMI of greater than 25, but less than 30. And then above 30 is obese. So this just shows you the worldwide distribution of people who are overweight or obese. So we can compare that to the distribution of breast cancer incidence across the world. And you can see from this that many of the countries that have high levels of people being overweight and obese have high levels of breast cancer. So in particular, here's the US, Europe, Australia, other countries. There's a lot of breast cancer. And these are countries that have high incidence of people being overweight and obese. So that's just a very general association. Now we can get a little bit more specific. So if we look at epidemiological studies, they have linked obesity to a number of cancers. And I want to talk about some of the studies in breast cancer. So with breast cancer, we really have to divide it into premenopausal breast cancer and postmenopausal. So in studies of premenopausal breast cancer, there have been many studies, most of them fairly small, and so they're not very well powered. But if you can combine studies, you can actually increase the power to see differences. So a pooled analysis of 7 studies with over 300,000 women found that there was actually a decreased risk of getting breast cancer. The relative risk was 0.54. And another analysis different by a different lab of 20 studies with over 2.5 million women found, again, there was about an 8% decreased risk of breast cancer for each 5 kilogram per meter squared increase in BMI. But other studies like the breast cancer prevention trial, which had over 5,000 women, they found that obesity was associated with an increased risk of breast cancer. So this has been a problem in studies of premenopausal women, is that some studies have positive associations, some have negative associations, and it's not really clear what's going on. And we'll get into that in a little more detail in a moment. For the postmenopausal women, the situation is a little clearer. Pretty much all of the studies have shown that there is an obesity-associated risk of breast cancer. So the Million Women study with over 1 million women in the UK found that obesity was associated with a 30% higher risk of getting breast cancer. And then a pooled analysis of 34 smaller studies, which actually totaled about 2.5 million women, found that for each 5 kilogram per meter squared increase in BMI, there was a 12% increase in risk. So this is pretty consistent in postmenopausal women, that there is an obesity breast cancer connection. So one of the problems in breast cancer is we know that there are different types of breast cancer, and they're not all the same. There are the luminal type breast cancers, which are the hormone receptor positive, estrogen receptor, progesterone receptor positive ones. And these probably account for, half or a little over half of all cases. There are the HER2 enriched ones. So these are cancers that have amplification of the HER2 gene. And these are responsive to Herceptin and other similar therapies. And then there are what are called the triple negative breast cancers. So these are steroid receptor negative and also HER2 negative. And there's actually two subtypes of the triple negative. These tend to have a poorer outcome, and the basal-like ones particularly have a higher proliferation rate. So what's the evidence that the different types of breast cancer respond the same way to obesity? So in this study, they looked at all the previous studies where the estrogen receptor and progesterone receptor and HER2 status was known. And then they separated them into ER-positive cases and triple-negative cases. So you see all these studies, these are ER-PR positive. And if you look, and this is in the premenopausal case, if you look at these studies, a lot of them do show this reduced risk of ER-positive hormone receptor-positive tumors. If you look at the triple negatives, actually there's an increased risk of triple negative breast cancer in many of these premenopausal studies. So this is probably the reason why the studies in premenopausal women have shown these varying results, because it's going to depend on the makeup of the cancers in that study. What's the relative proportion of triple negative versus ER positive? So the data can go either way when they're all grouped together as just breast cancer. If we look at the postmenopausal, it's a little different. So this shows the breakdown of ER positive and triple negative for the postmenopausal studies. And here we see that all of these studies show an increased risk of the ER-PR positive tumors in the postmenopausal. Triple negative is actually not really affected by obesity. Okay, so in the postmenopausal state, it tends to be mainly the hormone responsive cancers that are increased by obesity. So that's just looking at incidence, right? But what about mortality? What does obesity do when someone has breast cancer? So there have been a number of studies looking at the outcomes. The American Cancer Society prevention study of almost 500,000 women reported there was increased mortality with increased BMI. So women with who are obese, BMI greater than 30, had a 65% increase in mortality. Another study, it was a meta-analysis of 82 small studies, but totaled over 200,000 breast cancer survivors. They found a 40% increase risk mortality in both pre and post-menopausal women. And in a UK study, the POSH study, which was actually in young breast cancer survivors, so young being less than 41 years old, obesity was associated with larger tumors. They're more aggressive, with positive lymph node status and a higher percentage of the triple negative. And the overall 8-year survival and disease-free interval was significantly shorter. So this seems to be consistent across all of the studies, that obesity has a detrimental effect on survival for all breast cancers in both pre and post-menopausal women. So although the effect on the incidence differed, whether it's pre and post, the effect on mortality once you have the cancer is the same across all types. So interestingly, when you look at some of these studies, they also looked at not just obesity, but they looked at insulin levels. And in this Women's Health Initiative study of over 90,000 postmenopausal women, they found that insulin levels were associated with a twofold increase in breast cancer risk. But this was only seen in women who are not on hormone replacement therapy. In another study, in the Nurses' Health Study, they also found that insulin, in this case, was not associated with a high breast cancer risk. And when these studies factored out the insulin effect from the obesity effect, they found that much of the obesity risk can be attributed or explained by the elevated insulin levels. So that raises the question, what's the link between obesity and insulin? Is insulin really the bad player here in the obesity effect? So what's the link between the two? So this data here is from a study where they brought people into the clinical setting and they did what's called a euglycemic hyperinsulinic clamp study. So this is a way, it's a very sophisticated way of measuring how sensitive an individual is to insulin. How well does insulin work in that individual? Okay, and then they plotted their insulin sensitivity here on the y-axis against the body mass index, so how obese the individual was. And what you'll notice is there's an inverse correlation here, that the higher the BMI, the more obese the individual, the less sensitive they are to insulin. So the individuals who are obese become resistant to the insulin, so it's insulin resistance. And they did this in both Americans of European descent and also of African descent. And you see similar trends in both populations. So increased BMI obesity causes a reduction in sensitivity or an increase in resistance. What does that then do? What does this increase in resistance do? So for this, I want to talk about some work that Steve Kahn at the University of Washington has done. And he has come up with this model for how insulin sensitivity or resistance is related to insulin secretion. So if you plot an individual's sensitivity index versus their insulin secretion, it falls somewhere on this curve. So this is the normal curve here. So someone who is very insulin sensitive has low insulin secretion because they don't need much insulin because they're very sensitive to it, okay? Conversely, someone who is insulin resistant down this end of the scale needs to secrete a lot more insulin to have the body have the same effect. So because they're resistant, they over-secrete insulin so that their body can regulate its glucose levels. So you can move up and down this curve and you're still normal, right? Your body will adapt. You might do a whole bunch of exercise and become more sensitive, and so your insulin secretion goes down. On the other hand, you may sit on the couch too much and you become more resistant, and so your body will compensate by making and releasing more insulin. But as long as you stay on this curve, you are in the normal range. If you fall off this curve and actually stop making the correct amount of insulin for your degree of resistance, you actually progress through impaired glucose tolerance and pre-diabetes, and eventually you become diabetic. And that's when you've fallen off this curve because your body can no longer compensate, it can no longer adjust its insulin secretion for your insulin resistance. So individuals who have low insulin sensitivity down here who are obese compensate by secreting lots of insulin to keep their glucose levels normal. So what does this do in terms of cancer? So obesity causes insulin resistance and hyperinsulinemia. Insulin, as well as regulating glucose levels, it's also a growth factor. It's a mitogen, and it stimulates cells to proliferate. So there can be direct effects of insulin on tumor cells. And most tumor cells have receptors for insulin, and they will proliferate and they'll grow faster when they see insulin. There can also be indirect effects. So insulin has effects on the liver and elsewhere. It can change the levels of other growth factors like the IGFs. And again, those have mitogenic effects on the tumor cell to cause them to grow faster. Obesity also has effects by expanding adipose tissue, right? So you have more adipocytes, more fat cells, and they express the aromatase enzyme. So we can get peripheral conversion of steroids into estrogens, okay? So the estrogen levels can go up locally in the tissue. So that can have an effect directly on the tumor cell, particularly on the hormone receptor positive tumors. The increased adiposity also causes an increase in release of inflammatory cytokines. And these inflammatory cytokines can either have effects directly back on the tumor cell or on the local microenvironment. In this case, in the breast, in the stromal tissue, that can support growth of the tumor. And then lastly, the insulin resistance and obesity can also change the microbiota in the intestines, and the microbiota, the bugs, can release factors that can support tumor growth. So the elevated insulin is only one of the mechanisms that can support tumor growth. There's other potential mechanisms at play here too. But obesity is triggering all of these things to support the tumor growth. So how do we treat obesity? So the current strategies are dieting, so either caloric restriction, weight loss, or switching to a healthy diet, a Mediterranean diet, or with lots of green vegetables, or exercise, or for severe cases of morbid obesity, bariatric surgery. Or now there are some new drugs that target obesity and actually will help people lose weight. So do any of these approaches actually reduce the risk of breast cancer? So if we look at some of these studies, if you have sustained weight loss after the age of 50, that will reduce the risk of breast cancer. So in this study, they measured weight over 10 years, over 2 5-year intervals. And they found that women who had sustained weight loss over both 5-year intervals of greater than 9 kilograms had a reduced risk of breast cancer. If the weight loss was a little less, it was between 4.5 and 9. The risk was also lower, but not quite as good as the higher weight loss. But basically, any weight loss that's sustained would reduce the risk of breast cancer. If the weight loss wasn't sustained, maybe it went down for 5 years, but the other 5 years it wasn't, or if there was sustained weight gain, that had no effect on breast cancer incidence. But sustained weight loss will have a positive effect on reducing breast cancer incidence. If you just change the diet, okay, without trying to trigger weight loss, what does that do? So there have been 2 big studies of this. One was the Women's Health Eating and Living study that John Pierce ran at UCSD. And that looked at almost 3,000 women. And the intervention was to change them to a healthy diet, green vegetables, lots of fruit, high fiber. There was no weight loss, so this was not a weight loss study. And then the Women's Intervention Nutrition study, again, was over 2,000 women. And they were switched to a low-fat diet to see if that would have an effect. And there was a small weight loss in the study, but that wasn't the goal of the study. There were no reduction in cancer outcomes in either study. So simply changing your diet to a healthy diet does not do anything in the absence of any weight loss. If you add physical activity, just some exercise, what happens? So this basically summarizes the studies that have been completed in the top panel versus those that are ongoing. And if you look at these studies, here's the wins in the wheel study, but there are some others as well. They had changes in diet and some physical activity. Some of them were just feasibility, looking at weight loss. Others were looking at disease-free survival. So they're actually looking to see if there was a cancer outcome. There were no differences in any of these cancer outcomes, the disease-free survivals in these studies. So it sort of suggested that just changing your diet and maybe getting a little more exercise is not going to do anything. There are still a number of studies that are ongoing in breast cancer patients, early stage, and then some later stage ones here with diet and exercise, or just diet alone or exercise, looking at cancer endpoints. These are ongoing, so we'll have to wait to see what the results are. But based on the earlier studies, I don't expect these to really have much effect on their own unless they trigger a substantial weight loss. That's not to say that physical activity is not beneficial. It can improve some cancer-related outcomes, although not changing incidence. There's significant evidence that there's a beneficial effect of physical activity on outcomes such as anxiety, depressive symptoms, fatigue, quality of life, lymphedema, and physical function. So I'm not telling people don't get some exercise, don't be active, because that will increase your well-being, although it won't necessarily have an effect on breast cancer incidence. Bariatric surgery is an interesting one to look at. This tends to be performed in morbidly obese people. And if you look at women that underwent bariatric surgery versus matched controls, there was an increase in cancer-free survival in those that underwent the surgery. And this is for all cancers. If you look at obesity-associated cancers, you see the same thing, that there's this increase in survival for those that had surgery. So this is actually looking pretty good. This is a way of causing significant weight loss in a relatively short period of time. If you look at different types of cancer, this is the overall risk reduction. And it's broken down into colon, endometrial, gallbladder, kidney, liver. And the ones that show the most effect are colon, endometrial, pancreas, and postmenopausal breast cancer. So these all show a reduced risk of mortality by the bariatric surgery. So if you look a little closer at the breast cancer, what we see is that in premenopausal breast cancer, it's really the ER negative ones that benefit. So they have a hazard risk of 0.37. So this shows a much greater reduction in risk than the ER positive. Whereas if you look at the postmenopausal, it's the other way. It's the ER positive ones that show the reduction in risk rather than the ER negative or the triple negative. So again, here, pre and postmenopausal seem to be different in their response. But this is a nice study that shows that, you know, weight loss due to bariatric surgery can actually have a beneficial effect. So what else can we do? We know that these will work if they trigger weight loss, but we also know, and I'm sure a lot of people are aware of this, that it's very difficult to maintain that kind of weight loss over an extended period. Even people with bariatric surgery will put on the weight. And there are a lot of people that underwent surgery. There are people who were on also on like things like the weight loss shows. You know, they all put on the weight again. After 5 years, most of them are back to where they were originally. So it's very difficult to keep that weight off. So is there another solution? Now, this is where I want to introduce intermittent fasting. And this has seen some interest in the media over the last year or two. And there's various types of intermittent fasting. I just want to explain the differences here. So there is alternate day fasting, which is basically a day of eating normally followed by a day of fasting. And you might do this, you know, 3 to 4 times a week. But you can eat whenever you want. On the feed day, you eat whenever you want. There's a modification where actually on the fasting day, you allow people to have a small amount of food, 25% of their normal calories. And then there's a 5-2 diet, which is quite popular, which is, you know, 5 days of normal eating and then 2 days of reduced intake of 25%. Okay, but you can eat whenever you want. All of these have some caloric restriction because the fasting day, you're eating less calories and you're not compensating on the feeding day. You're just eating the normal amount on the feeding day, but you're eating less on the fasting day. So overall, there's a caloric restriction. Time-restricted feeding, which is what we're interested in, doesn't involve any caloric restriction. So you eat the same calories on every single day. Okay, all you do is change the period in which you eat the calories. So here they're showing it as in a 10-hour window. Okay, we actually try and shoot for an 8-hour window, a little bit shorter, but you're not changing the caloric intake. This is not a diet. It's not for weight loss. It's simply changing when you eat. Now, some of these fasting regimens actually have some origin in some of the religious fasts, like Ramadan fasting is an out-of-phase version of time-restricted eating where you actually eat at night rather than during the day. And then Sunnah fasting is a weekly fasting on Monday and Thursday, which is similar to a 5-2 kind of diet. So I don't actually like time-restricted feeding being called intermittent fasting because it's really, to me, it's not fasting. It's simply changing when you eat the calories, not what you eat. Now, we know that physiology follows circadian rhythms. We know that there's a wake-sleep cycle, and we know there are differences in your physiology between these two periods. So when you're awake, you tend to be eating, and so glycogen and cholesterol and bile acid synthesis is up. You're secreting insulin. You're making fatty acids because you're eating during this period. Conversely, when you're asleep at night, you're not taking in any nutrients. And so the liver starts to break down glycogen. It starts to release glucose to keep your body going. You start to metabolize fat, and your metabolism switches to a more oxidative state. So it's known there is this cycle, and there's these changes in physiology over 24 hours. What's synchronizing this clock? Well, we know that a lot of the clock mechanisms are sensitive to light, and that's through the optic nerve and the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the brain, and it senses the light-dark cycles and sets the central clock in the central nervous system. The same clock mechanism is also present in every other tissue, whether it's lungs, hearts, livers, okay? And it can respond to these central cues, the light-dark cues, through things such as melatonin, but it also responds to other signals. So in the peripheral tissues, the clocks will respond to nutritional signals. And in fact, those signals tend to override the central light-dark clock. So that becomes a problem because our eating habits are not synced to our circadian rhythms. So during evolution, they were, because we would eat during the day, but at night, you wouldn't venture out because of the predators, and so you would fast overnight. But now with preserving food, with refrigeration, we can eat 24 hours a day. And in fact, if you measure when people eat for 15 to 18 hours per day. So this was a study done by Sachin Panda's group. They created a phone app where people would take a photo every time they ate. And then, so every circle here is an individual. Every dot in that circle is an instance where they had a meal. And this is done over a number of weeks. People recorded their eating habits. And so you plot them on this wheel and you see that basically from 11 p.m. to 6 a.m., people slowed down and they weren't eating. But the rest of the time, they were eating, right? So our consumption of nutrients has far exceeded the normal 12-12 cycle in which we evolved. And that's a problem because it's overriding the circadian clocks in the tissues. So what happens when you disrupt the clock? Well, this is a study where they forced people to have misaligned clocks. So they allowed people to have a 24-hour clock, and then they switched them to a 28-hour clock. So progressively, the day was longer, and they would get progressively out of sync. And then they gave them breakfast, lunch, dinner, and a snack, and they measured the glucose levels and insulin levels. And you see that in the misaligned people, the glucose levels after the meals were much higher. The insulin was elevated. They were hypersecreting. If you just measure 2 hours after each meal, you see that the glucose levels were higher, the insulin levels were higher. So simply misaligning the clocks caused an impairment to metabolism. In another study, they looked at over 100 young people, and it was a 30-day cross-sectional study, and they just let the people have their normal eating habits. And then they looked at what time of day do they consume the most calories, and that's indicated by the arrow here, the black arrow. And then they looked at their body fats. They found that the people that ate most of the calories earlier in the day, so this is when they were asleep. This is typically when melatonin would start to rise. So if they had a bigger period between their peak nutrient consumption and the dark phase, they had a lower body fat. People that ate later in the afternoon tended to have more body fat, okay? And there was no relation with the amount of calories they ate, with what the meal macronutrients were, what they were eating, activity or sleep duration. It was simply a product of how close the calories were consumed to the onset of this, the dark fasting phase. And we can do this in animals as well. So this is a rodent study, and it showed that if you feed rodents during the dark phase, rodents are nocturnal, so they're active at night and they eat at night. That's when they would normally eat. So this is a measure of activity, and you see in the gray here that they're active during the night and they basically sleep during the light. If you feed them during the light phase, so out of phase with their normal behavior, they still have some activity during the dark because that's when they should be active. But now they've got activity during the light phase because this is when they're eating. And what does that do? it increases their body weight. So they put on weight when they're fed during the light, and they're eating the same amount of calories and their activity is the same. So it's not changing energy expenditure. They are simply putting on weight when they are fed out of phase with their normal circadian rhythm. So we now know that this circadian disruption is associated with many, many diseases and disorders, right from young babies and children in terms of irritability, mood swings, compromised learning, daytime sleepiness, childhood obesity, anxiety. This is the reason why the school day should start at 9 a.m., not earlier the way it does at the moment. There's a big push to actually make the school day start later, because that's actually beneficial for kids. But as people older, there are many other diseases that are associated with circadian disruptions: obesity, fatty liver disease, heart disease, cancer, type 2 diabetes, even things like Alzheimer's and Huntington's. These are all associated with circadian disruptions. So can you correct any of this? If we correct the clock, can you reverse any of these problems? So the idea here is that if we take, say, a mouse and we let them eat a high-fat diet, here shown by the hamburgers, whenever they want, they would basically eat all day long, and their circadian rhythms get dampened and they become obese. If you allow the same mouse the same diet, but you just restrict when they eat it to their normal phase, which is at night, you reinforce their circadian rhythms. And the question is, well, does that correct the metabolism? So we've done some studies in this area, but we're obviously not the only people doing this. And I want to point out Sachin Panda's group at the Salk Institute, Paolo Sassoni-Corsi's lab at UC Irvine, and then the two Joes, Joe Takahashi and Joe Bass, have all done many, many studies in this area. And all the labs basically see the same effects. So what happens, this is a study we did in female mice, because we were interested in whether this was true in females. And these were overreactomized. So it's a postmenopausal model of female metabolism. And if you feed the mice their normal chow, which is a high fiber, low fat, they maintain a normal body weight. If you give them a high fat diet, we allow that they become obese. So we allow them to become obese, and they're up to 40 grams, basically almost double the weight. And then we switch them to continued eating whenever they want versus a time restricted. So they're only allowed to have access to the food for 8 hours. So we see that initially there's a small drop in weight and then it stabilizes, whereas the ones that eat over 24 hours keep getting fatter and fatter. Okay. If you look at their food intake, normally for the normal chow in blue, they eat more during the night and then it comes down during the day. For the high fat diet, which is a very highly caloric diet, they basically eat all the time. And for the time restricted, now we see that because they only have the food here in this pink interval, they eat a lot during this interval and then nothing the rest of the time. But they're eating the same amount of calories. There's no difference in the calorie intake between the ad libitum fed over 24 hours versus the time restricted. So at the end of the study, the glucose levels are higher in the obese ad libitum, the insulin levels are higher, and these are reduced in the time feeding group. And if we look at their metabolism, their glucose metabolism, and we do a glucose tolerance test at 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks of the intervention, we see initially that the obese animals have impaired glucose tolerance here compared to the mice on normal chow. So the glucose levels are much higher. They're starting to come down a bit in the timed feeding. We're getting a little bit of separation here with the 24-hour ad libitum versus the time feeding. After another couple of weeks, now we're starting to see some separation, and these are starting to become more like normals. And after 8 weeks, basically the time feeding group look like the lean normal animals, whereas the ad libitum ones are still glucose intolerant. So the timed feeding does improve metabolism in mice. Now, we also tested this in a model of weight regain because yo-yo dieting is a big problem. Everyone knows that you go on a diet, you lose weight, but then you put it on again. And it seems to come back even faster the next time. So we modeled that, and we allowed the mice to have the high-fat diet and get obese. And then we put them on the normal chow low-fat diet, and we allowed the weight to come back down to match the controls. And at that point, we put them either back on 24-hour access to the high-fat diet or timed access to the high-fat diet in green. And then some we just continued on the low-fat diet. And you see that the ones that went back on the high-fat diet with 24-hour access put on the weight again. Whereas the ones that had the timed access basically maintained the same weight, and it was statistically no different from the ones from the lean animals who had continued on the normal chow. So it was preventing the weight regain in a yo-yo diet kind of model. And we can see that it has good effects on metabolism too, because the glucose tolerance test during this first period of overeating, we see that the obese mice are glucose intolerant. That is corrected completely after the diet. But then when they go back onto the second period of overeating, they become glucose intolerant again. But the timed feeding prevents that from happening, even though they're eating the same amount of the highly caloric diet. So it's preventing this weight regain. And so it actually suggests that this timed feeding approach might be useful in women that are on these diets. So does this work in humans? So there was some studies in small studies in pre-diabetic men who compared early time-restricted feeding to normal eating patterns. And they found that actually the postprandial insulin went down, the insulin sensitivity went up, beta cell function went up, blood pressure went down, oxidative stress went down. So they're all positive trends. There was another study done by Sachin Panna and Pam Taub that did a similar thing. Again, a fairly small study, 19 participants with pre-diabetes. And they found that when they put them on a time-restricted feeding for 10 hours, they had a little bit of weight loss. The blood pressure went down, cholesterol went down, hemoglobin A1C went down, and they reported better sleep. So it does look like it is working to improve metabolism. So there's a large ongoing study now in San Diego in 150 firefighters that Pam Taub and Sachin Panna are doing. And this has just started, so we'll see in a couple of years as to how they did. But we need some large-scale studies to show that this is really true in the general population. So can this have an effect on cancer? So our idea was that if we use this timed feeding, will it prevent cancer growth? So we used a model of postmenopausal breast cancer, and we used a high-fat diet to make the mice obese, or genetic models of obesity. And you see that the mice become very fat here. This is body weight. And then we inject them with breast cancer cells, and we watch the rate of the breast cancer growth. And you see that any time that the mice is obese, either the high-fat diet or the genetic obesity, you get much larger tumors. And if we correlate the tumor weight versus body weight, we see this nice positive correlation that the higher the body weight, the larger the tumor, the more aggressive the tumor. So we did a design where we used these postmenopausal models. We used two different models, the ovarectomy versus a chemically induced menopause. And we did our feeding strategy with a timed feeding versus the ad libitum high-fat diet or the normal chow control. And we did it with two different breast cancers. One was a luminal A, which was an ER/PR positive, and the other was a HER2 or an ERB2 positive tumor. And so what we see is when we do the timed feeding here in pink, that the tumors grow much slower at the rate they do in the lean animals, that the obese animals where the tumors grow faster, the effect of the obesity is completely eliminated. And we see that with different models of menopause. See the same thing in the VCD model. We see the same thing with the HER2 positive tumor, that it grows much slower with TRF. And we also did it in a spontaneous tumor model. So this is not injecting tumor cells. This is allowing cells in an oncogene-induced model in mice. And we see that there's a delay in the appearance of tumors, and the tumors grow much slower in the timed feeding group. So it does look like this is preventing breast cancer growth. We also did it in a model, and we allowed the mice to get tumors first, and then we put them on TRF to see if this could be used therapeutically. And we found that in this case, again, the TRF reduces the growth of pre-existing tumors. So it suggests there might be some therapeutic benefit, not just in preventing it, but actually in once the tumors are there. We then went on to show that it was actually the insulin levels that were doing this. So we artificially changed the insulin levels using an insulin pump. And we found that if we did the time-restricted feeding plus gave them insulin, now it looked just like the obese ad libitum animals. And the beneficial effect of the timed feeding was completely eliminated. Okay. If we decrease insulin levels with a drug called diazoxide, and we do this in the obese mice, we find that actually the drug alone looks like the TRF group. So reducing the insulin levels alone will stop the tumors growing so fast. So we believe that it's actually through modulating the insulin levels that this is really happening. So is there any evidence that this might actually work in humans? So there are no direct studies. It might be positive. So Catherine Marinac, who is a graduate student with Ruth Patterson, who's one of my colleagues, looked at the Women's Healthy Eating and Living study, and they had data on when people slept and how much they ate. And they found that fasting for less than 13 hours overnight was associated with an increased risk of breast cancer recurrence. There's another study in China that showed a similar thing. So eating after 10 p.m. was associated with an increased risk of breast cancer. And then a study in Spain that found that a longer interval between the last meal and sleep was associated with a lower cancer risk. So eating late at night is bad. Okay, you need a long fasting interval at night. But these are epidemiological studies that no one has actually tested this in a controlled trial. So I went on the clinicaltrials.gov to see, what the current status was with clinical trials, and these are the only trials that are ongoing of intermittent fasting or timed feeding, and 4 of the 5 are just pilot studies to look at feasibility, whether you can do this. There's one study in Germany that's looking at this intermittent fasting as an addition to chemotherapy in breast and ovarian cancer. And they're recruiting 150 subjects to see if doing a timed feeding approach will actually improve the benefits of chemotherapy. So what we really need are some large controlled, randomized controlled trials of testing this timed feeding and looking at cancer outcomes to really know if this is going to work. So I know that a lot of people are interested in this, and a lot of people ask for sort of what are my recommendations, and I have colleagues that have asked me, and I kind of give them my 2 cents as to how I think it should be done. I will say I'm not a clinician, so I'm not giving you any medical advice, but I'm a basic scientist, and I look at these studies in humans, and I look at the animal studies, and this is basically what I've come up with. So if you are interested in trying prolonged nightly fasting, don't change your diet. Just continue eating what you normally eat. Okay, you don't have to go on a low carb, low fat, paleo or anything like that. Just eat what you want to eat. Try to limit your food consumption to 8 hours during the day. So I do this, and I try and eat between 10 a.m. and 6 p.m. Okay. Avoid eating within 4 hours of going to sleep. It is very bad to eat late afternoon, early evening, because that meal is not fully digested and metabolized before you go to sleep. So you want to avoid eating in the evenings. Oh. No, crap.
Hi, I just want to tell you that we're having some technical difficulties right now. We hope to remedy them soon, and we'll then proceed with the webinar. Thank you, and we apologize for any inconvenience.
Oh, hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry, something happened. My internet shut down. All of a sudden, it just froze and dropped me off the network. I'm very sorry about that.
Not a problem.
But I had reached the end of my talk, so I can probably just stop and take questions now.
Okay, so let's get started in the Q&A. You can still submit questions in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get through all of the submitted questions, but we may not be able to due to time constraints. So let's get started by asking, I think we know the answer to this, but do I eat any special foods when fasting intermittently?
No, just eat the normal things you want to eat. It's not a question of what diet, it's a question of when you eat.
What is the relationship between obesity and HER2 cancers?
It's not so clear. Whereas with the hormone receptor positive and the triple negatives, the data was pretty clear as to where the obesity effect was. I don't think it's that clear whether there is an effect of obesity on a HER2 positive tumor. But I don't know that they've looked at enough studies to really say.
How many times a day should you eat?
That's entirely up to you. Just eat your normal routine. Have 3 meals a day or 2 meals. Up to you. It's just try and keep it within that 8-hour window. So personally, I eat breakfast or an early lunch around 10 or so, and then I'll eat late afternoon 5 to 6. I'll have dinner then.
When you're comparing the data between pre and post-menopausal women, are you referring to if they were diagnosed pre or post, or if they are currently survivors who are either pre and post-menopausal?
The studies were when it was diagnosed. Now, someone who was diagnosed pre, but now they're post, it's not. I'm not sure whether they would. In the case of people that are diagnosed, it's clear from the mortality data that obesity has a bad effect on all cancers. It's only the incidence that seems to be a difference between the pre and post. But once you have breast cancer, obesity is detrimental, and you should try and lose weight or do the time-restricted feeding to prevent recurrence.
How many hours should I fast for it to be effective in losing weight?
That's a good question. I mean, I go for 16 hours, but I know some of the studies, they are trying to get people to fast for 14 hours. It is known that doing this timed feeding, you don't have to do it 7 days a week. You can take weekends off. That's fine. It doesn't seem to do anything as long as you do it for 5 days during the week. But if you can manage, at least 13 to 14 hours fasting, that is probably okay. No one has done the studies, with different periods to show that it's actually better if you have 16 versus 14. So it's kind of up to the individual.
Someone has asked if you could show your last slide again and recap the last 4 points.
Unfortunately, I was kicked off the internet, and so I'll have to see if I can log in and share it again. I don't have it on my iPhone, unfortunately. I'm now logged in on the iPhone. But the points are: is continue your normal diet, try and restrict your eating to an 8-hour window. Don't eat before bed. You've got to have at least 4 hours between your last meal and going to bed. Hold on, let me see if I can pull up my slides again. But that was basically it. You can take weekends off. You don't have to do it 7 days a week. 5 days a week is usually good enough. So, if you're going out with friends on the weekend and want to have dinner out in a restaurant, that's fine. Don't worry about it.
What foods should be eaten when not fasting?
Whatever you want to eat. Normal diet. As I said, it's not about what you eat, it's when you eat. If you want to have a hamburger, have a hamburger.
Does reducing carbs have an impact?
Again, it's not about what you eat, it's when. If you want to combine time restricted with a diet, that will probably work too, and it will probably help with the weight loss. But that's not that's not what this is really about.
Does fasting help with recurrence in breast or metastases?
Yes. So the evidence is that it prevents recurrence. Certainly in the animal models, the time feeding prevented lung metastasis. So that seemed to be independent of the effects on the tumor growth, because when we actually do a study look specifically at metastasis, the time feeding or the the restriction, the fasting would prevent metastasis.
Is time-restricted feeding helpful to prevent recurrence if you're not obese?
That is an issue that we don't really know as yet. Most of what we see is that it prevents the effect of the obesity. But certainly in the models we use, we're using cancer cells, so the cancers are going to grow. Right? It's not like they're going to stop the cancers growing. This is not like a chemotherapy, but it's getting rid of the obesity effect. So if you are lean and really healthy and you have low insulin levels, probably the time feeding is not going to do much for you. That would be my guess, but there's no real data to support that.
Why is BMI being used when it can give altered results? For example, an athlete might have a higher BMI and not be obese.
That's a very good, because one of the problems with these studies is when you look at different populations, a BMI of 25 in a Caucasian population is not necessarily the same BMI of 25 in, say, an Asian population. They may have greater insulin resistance for the same BMI. So it's unfortunate that we use BMI. That tends to be what everyone uses, but you have to be aware that the amount of insulin resistance for a given BMI is different. And obviously with athletes and people like that, then it's very different. Yes, they can have a high BMI and yet be very insulin sensitive because of all the exercise they get.
Does intermittent fasting work only to prevent recurrences? What about living longer with metastatic disease?
Again, the studies haven't been done to address that. If it's prevent recurrence and it's slowing growth of tumors, if it's slowing the growth of metastases, that would suggest that it would probably be beneficial for survival for someone, with metastatic breast cancer. But as I said, we haven't done those kind of studies yet. The only studies that have really been done have been looking at metabolism. As far as I know, there haven't been really any published studies of looking at effects of time-restricted feeding on these cancer outcomes. That's what we need to do. We need to have those trials.
Well, sadly, I think we're coming to the end. We have one last question. We've got several questions, but this will be a sort of a good one to take us out. What about an alcoholic beverage at 9 p.m.?
No calories, no, nothing at all.
Oh my, okay.
Nothing at all. No drinks, no food, no drink after 6,
Ah, okay.
Except you get weekends off. So
Oh, okay. That's not so
go out
bad.
on a weekend.
Well, and you should restrict your alcohol intake if you've had breast cancer anyway. So I guess
Yeah,
that,
right.
Well, I want to thank you, Dr. Webster, for a very informative program. And thanks to all of you for participating and submitting questions. We would like it if you could take a moment to fill out the survey at the end of the webinar. The survey will show up in your browser when the webinar ends, and the link will also be in the follow-up email. All surveys are anonymous. Thank you and have a great day. And again, it's been our pleasure.
Can I just say thank you for the opportunity to talk today, and I apologize again for my internet. I don't know what happened, but luckily it was right at the end, so didn't miss much.
It's technology. It was great. Thank you again so very much.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.